Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you, Avner, for bringing the warm weather. This was much needed. What you're about to hear are fragments of a project that's still in a rather early state, and that is also related to what you just heard, but at times orthogonal to it, because it's really about a set of institutions that were neither state institutions nor clan institutions, though they were clearly particularistic, because they're based more on residence than anything else. But let me just say, this is a topic I come to from a couple of directions. On the one hand, through some work that a number of us have done, that's made clear that during the late imperial period and early 20th century, most tenants in the Yangzi Delta, and this is the larger Lower Yangzi region. Click here to move this down. Yes. The gray is the sort of core of the Lower Yangzi, so that's mostly what I will be talking about. This is the richest region in China until very recently, and that's an even more detailed map of it. That most tenants in this area and in other relatively developed parts of China had very strong cultivation rights. In other words, they were hard to evict unless they got very far behind in the rent or committed serious offenses of some sort. Thanks in significant part to that security, rents on land with these kinds of secure leases rose much more slowly than productivity, which meant that over time, these tenants became much better off than those without such rights. Data from the 18th through the early 20th century pretty consistently suggests that these tenants with secure cultivation rights earn from 2.5 to 3 times as much per year as tenants who have a similar sized plot but have it on a short-term lease. And those tenants who have short-term leases actually earn incomes that roughly approximate that of a fully employed year-round wage laborer, which is in fact what you kind of expect, right? If a tenant has nothing to sell but his labor power, rents ought to rise to a level where they're earning roughly the same as somebody else who has nothing to sell but his labor power. The interesting thing is that these more secure tenants enjoy such a large premium. And that's obviously a very important benefit for them. And part of what I want to argue is they enjoy that benefit partly because of the way that villages organize to defend those benefits for their members. While this long-term security sometimes stemmed from a private contract between tenant and landlord, generally speaking, it was local communities, and I'm going to call them villages for simplicity, though the reality is actually a bit messier of what these communities are. It's these communities that conferred and guaranteed those rights. For the most part, villages protected those rights only for those who were seen as members of the village, and that membership was tied up with participation in the maintenance of local irrigation works and other kinds of infrastructure, in other words, in the maintenance of community assets. And in some cases, villages protected the rights of locals by ostracizing new arrivals who were willing to take up tenancies on less favorable terms, including denying them access to the irrigation water. A very effective way of getting rid of an unwanted community member in an agricultural village. One noteworthy aspect of these arrangements was that village-level power operated in spite of often being in explicit violation of the formal legal code. In fact, until the 20th century, these villages had no legal existence whatsoever. They do not exist from the point of view of the Qing Code. So how do they manage to do this? Now, I want to briefly contrast the Yangtze Delta with the Pearl River Delta, the area near Hong Kong, which is, roughly speaking, the second richest part of the country, and which, like the Yangtze Delta, is also based on irrigated rice, and which conveniently, though I didn't know the talk that I was going to come after, is area where cooperation is much more based on kinship than it is in the lower Yangzi. So in the far south, kinship often lay behind the strength of these kinds of arrangements. Large agnatic lineages often dominated villages, so that all males in the village had, in fact, had the same surname. They managed the irrigation works and local defense. They financed land reclamation. They owned a lot of land as corporate lineages, with poorer members doing the actual farming and the rents going to run lineage schools, temples, and welfare funds, not unlike what you just heard. But this was much less true in the Yangzi Delta. Single surname villages were quite rare there. Kinship groups rarely managed irrigation or other territorially based functions after roughly the 15th century. And while lineages did often operate schools, temples, and funds for widows and orphans, the wealth that supported this was as often invested in commerce or urban real estate as it was in farmland, meaning that they're much less of a presence in the countryside. So the rural communities that guaranteed the rights that I'm interested in today had neither statutory authority nor the authority of lineages, which, in addition to the cultural sanction that they enjoyed, often did have formal legal authorization to act as corporate bodies, something that was pretty rare in imperial China. And yet these community-granted rights that I want to talk about were, if anything, even more entrenched in the Yangtze Delta than in places like the Pearl River Delta. And even more striking, they were most entrenched of all in places like the outskirts of Suzhou, which was probably the most completely marketized place in the entire empire. Roughly 90% of the land in the countryside around Suzhou is owned by non-resident landlords. Almost everybody buys a large portion of their food supply and engages in other kinds of activities, so on and so forth. So most of what I want to do here is to trace how this system of entrenched tenant rights came about and how it worked. But I do have a second approach to this topic, which comes from something that I know much less about, and that's post-Mao China. As many of you probably know, and as we heard a little bit about in the response to the last question earlier, villages, which were rechristened as production brigades, became much more powerful during the collectivist era, all over the country, in political, economic, and other terms. Despite considerable state penetration, villages were arguably closer to being closed communities on a day-to-day basis in the Maoist period than at any other time before or since. But in the 80s, most brigades contracted village land back to individual households to farm, collecting rent and reserving the right to reassign land so that the farmers didn't own it, but otherwise leaving management to the individual household. Other village assets were also often leased or even sold outright. You couldn't own land, but you could own most other things. Local cadres, who lost much of their ability to commandeer labor and who had very limited tax bases, became unable to provide much in the way of services, and the best economic opportunities were in the cities. Consequently, the fate of the village in much of China since the 80s has been to be hollowed out. However, some villages, mostly in the richest parts of the country, and again, especially in places like the Yangtze Delta and the Pearl River Delta, either held on to significant amounts of village assets, or they leased land back from the villagers. So first they contracted it out, then they leased it back, and pooled it. These collective assets often became the basis of village-owned industrial enterprises, either village-run, or in some cases village-owned but leased to an entrepreneur, and when leased to an entrepreneur, often with fairly elaborate conditions that were designed to spread the wealth within the village and to keep it from leaking out of the village. And we can talk about the details of this if people want to later on. So what happens in those villages is essentially that the people who are conceived of as village members become shareholders in a bunch of collectively owned village assets. A number of these villages became quite rich and remained so even after many of the township and village enterprises failed or were privatized in the mid-90s. The village's official members received income from their shares in these assets, but they couldn't sell those shares, while immigrants to these villages, who could not become members, even if they were longtime residents, unless they married a village member, did much of the work that no longer paid enough to attract shareholding members. So essentially they became guest workers. In the latest incarnation, at least for now, of this phenomenon, many of these villages actually survived the decline of rural industry quite nicely, turning the still pooled land that had been the sites for the township and village enterprises into sites for residential and commercial development on the edges of China's growing cities. The village members have been able to stay together physically, often by building high-rise apartments on one part of the land, and they maintain or even increase their incomes by leasing the rest of the collective land for buildings that others live and work in. Able to deliver fairly large blocks of consolidated land to urban authorities for development, and to negotiate on behalf of communities that had some wealth and some internal cohesion, the leaders of these quasi-corporate villages have often gotten dramatically better deals for their members than have been available to the members of villages that really decollectivized in the 1980s. Because in those cases, the individuals who wound up with a sliver of land are left negotiating with an urban authority. They have very little bargaining power, and that's where you get these stories that have now become famous or infamous of, the one holdout house surrounded by everybody else who has sold out for the development and who eventually usually gets shoved out by the police. Part of what's interesting here is that there seems to be a substantial, though by no means perfect, overlap between the places where we find these successful post-1980 corporate villages and the places where we find successful quasi-corporate villages in the late imperial period. Despite decades of tumult and enormous institutional, technological, and other change in between. So in some ways parallel to Avner, though on a, I would say, different timetable, I'm also telling the story of something that works for a while, does not work for roughly a century or century and a quarter, and then seems to work again. Might there be some connection here? Well, some Chinese scholars have suggested as much, but their arguments about the pre-49 world are frankly pretty impressionistic and usually dependent on fairly ad hoc invocations of this black box called local culture to explain solidarity. Ultimately, I'd like to see whether there are more systematic links spanning this long historical arc. But frankly, I'm not there yet. I'm not sure what those links might be. So for now, I'm going to focus on the parts of the story I know relatively well. If there's time, I'll talk a little bit about, at the end, about more recent things. And then if we have time, we can all speculate together. One striking thing about the late imperial period is that you have high degrees of commercialization, including very active land markets, for centuries, without the emergence of a large class of landless wage workers. Even the very wild price fluctuations of the 16th and 17th century. Okay. Anyway, even this period where you have really, really wild price fluctuations does not seem to result in large numbers of people losing their ability to hold on to the land. In fact, landholding seems to become somewhat less concentrated over time, and those who do own lots of land become less likely to manage it in large blocks. Instead, they rent it out to lots and lots of tenants. Proletarians were under 10% of the 18th century rural workforce. Almost every household either owned some land or had a relatively secure tenancy. And full-time wage workers were even less common, though this had been the most commercialized, in the Yangzi Delta, I should say, though this had been the most commercialized part of the empire since at least the 1100s. As late as the 1920s, only 15% of Delta farm work was done for wages, and much even of that farm of 15% was a few days a year being done by families supplementing the income from a small plot. No more than 40% of Delta farmers were smallholders, versus over 80% in some less commercialized regions. But Delta tenants, as I've said, had perhaps the strongest cultivation rights in the empire. Sometimes these rights are clearly embedded in a rental contract, and those cases are relatively unambiguous. But in a lot of cases, seemingly the majority, they come from custom. The contract-based rights often derive from having made a large cash rent deposit. But in that case, if your rent arrears reach the amount of your deposit, then your rights could be terminated, albeit not easily. In other cases, secure tenancy derived from a kind of sweat equity. Custom, later kind of grudgingly recognized in law, held that if one person provided the capital to reclaim land and another person provided otherwise unpaid labor, the default arrangement, in the absence of a written provision otherwise, was that once the land was productive, the guy who provided the capital got ownership rights, while the guy who provided the labor got usufruct rights. The main alternative was to take the land and actually divide it in two, with each person getting half of it. Over time, this was extended to a customary principle that the tenant could strengthen their claim to remain on the land by improving it, whether or not the landlord had been consulted. This led to at least one case I know of where a tenant facing eviction goes out and borrows money not to reduce his arrears, but to improve the land because he figures that will strengthen his claim to it. Something that obviously only makes sense if he figures that that principle is well recognized, because otherwise, what could be worse than borrowing to improve land that's about to be taken from you? It works, by the way. And perhaps most importantly, at least in the Yangzi Delta, this seems to have gradually bled into a customary principle, never recognized in the Qing Code, but quite powerful in the very large number of cases where land disputes were settled outside the magistrate's court, which held that consistent participation in the maintenance of community-managed infrastructure, which meant above all water control works, also conferred your rights to permanent tenancy. So you might argue that the extension is from originally, if you create the land in a deal with somebody else, you get permanent tenancy. Then it extends to something more like, if you improve the land without even necessarily having consulted the guy who owns the subsoil rights, it cements your claim. And then it goes a step further to, you can make something, you can help build or maintain something that's actually off-site, right? It's not on the piece of land, but it contributes to the fertility of that land. And that also helps cement your permanent tenancy rights. As this suggests, although there was an extensive written property law, it was usually a local community, which lacked authority in formal law, that provided the effective adjudication of most property and tenancy disputes. Moreover, in much of the country, and especially in the relatively rich, heavily irrigated regions of the South and East, a big part of being considered a full member of the community, and thus having it protect your claims, was participation in the maintenance of those works. And in the richest area of all, the Yangzi Delta, I want to argue that the shape of that community was very much a function of both the particularities of its physical environment and a set of historical changes rooted mostly in the Ming period, so 1368 to 1644. On the one hand, the Yangtze Delta has a rather peculiar feature, which is after a large seawall is built circa 1100, from then on, the rate at which the river deposited sediment and the rate at which the ocean eroded the coastline were in almost perfect balance. Thus, while seasonal fluctuations in water supply were very large and required careful management, there were few opportunities to create new land by extending the coastline. This is in sharp contrast to the Pearl River Delta, where a great deal of local organization was dedicated precisely to reclaiming new land. Coastlines moved out about 70 miles since the 14th century. Reclaiming new land required far more capital than managing irrigation and flood control for existing land, because years elapsed between the beginning of the process and the time the first crop could be harvested. It also required more connections, since new land claims had to be defended by organizing armed force during this long preparatory period, and often by registering claims with the county government as well. Thus, self-organization by relatively equal groups of village people, without much elite participation, was more plausible in the Yangtze Delta than in places where new land was being opened. Meanwhile, prosperity in the lower Yangtze created enough opportunities in the towns and cities, in commerce, government, education, etc., that the rich tended to move there. The withdrawal of elite leadership caused serious problems in the late Ming, but eventually irrigation communities were reconstituted on a new basis, which actually proved more efficient. Among other things, they tended to create smaller polders with more internal embankments, which considerably improved the control of water on the most interior plots, where poor people tended to have their land. Because of time constraints, I won't do too much here, but this is a large-style early polder. And basically, if you had one of these plots in the middle, where it says lower or xia, drainage was pretty rotten, and you did not have much of a stake in maintaining this. What happens, here's another picture of the same thing, and there you see that the middle land is so crummy that it's basically, it's a reed swamp, and you use it for grazing cattle or something. By the late Ming, what you get is this. Lots and lots of internal walls, much greater efficiency. The inner plots now have good water control as well. And what this means is that the poor, who have the inner plots, now have enough of a stake in the system that it's much easier to mobilize them, and you can meet the much higher labor demand that's needed to maintain this whole thing. So it's a nicely self-reinforcing system. As elites increasingly became outsiders to rural communities with little role in the production process, it became increasingly difficult for them to contest the long-term security of their tenants within the community setting. They could still try through the formal courts, but enforcement of those orders was spotty. Thus, though the Qing dynasty that came to power in 1644 was, at least at first, considerably more interested in simplifying property rights and protecting landlords, the Ming-Qing transition nonetheless wound up strengthening these tenant rights in practice because it accelerated the movement of landlords to towns and cities. Those landlords who did stay in villages were much more likely to have short-term tenants and to be able to really control their land. But especially in the Delta, they also became an increasingly minor percentage of the landlords. So the richest parts of China were the ones where tenants had the greatest power to resist what modern Westerners might consider the logical prerogatives of owners, in large part because while the land was private, there was quasi-collective control of the water that went with it. By the late 1600s, many of the customarily derived land use rights thus protected had also gained some recognition in formal law, and they could be sold, inherited, or mortgaged like other property. In fact, in the relatively few cases where we see the usufruct rights and the subsoil rights for the same piece of land being sold at the same time, the use rights had become consistently more valuable by 1700, with relative prices that actually match up nicely with estimates of tenant landlord and wage laborer incomes that I'd show you if we had time. However they were gained, these rights made long-term tenants secure enough to behave as if they were owners, so that they, rather than the subsoil owners, made most of the land-improving investments. Moreover, again like owners, they tended to earn something much closer to their average product than their marginal product. By contrast, wage earners or tenants at will earn something we think reasonably close to their marginal product. In fact, as I mentioned before, preliminary estimates suggest that pretty consistently, tenants with security earn 2.5 to 3 times as much as landless laborers, which, by the way, makes wages a dubious indicator of Chinese living standards, but that's another debate. Some of the groups that managed irrigation came to extend across multiple villages and to acquire other kinds of institutionalization, sometimes by founding a temple, which was a kind of entity the government was used to allowing to have assets and corporate personality. And villages did take on a variety of other functions, allocating responsibility for meeting corvée requirements, crop watching and other low-level policing, mediating disputes, and serving as the local repository for information on transactions, including, interestingly, certain kinds of marriages for which there were not written records. The ability of rural communities to maintain their members' usufruct rights was further stabilized by the grim fact that men who did become proletarians rarely reproduced. In a society which practiced sex-selective infanticide, while some elite households had concubines and female servants as well as wives, the poorest men rarely married. Thus, in each generation, some luckless smallholders and tenants fell into the proletariat, as you'd expect in a competitive, commercialized economy. But the number of people in that class didn't grow because the last generation of such people had very, very few heirs. Meanwhile, because rural wages were far below what most farmers earned, so were unskilled urban wages, right? Unskilled urban wages are not going to be much higher than rural ones. And that meant that even poorer than average tenants had little reason to head for the city. Having few incentives to leave, in turn, strengthened the basis of local cooperation, right? If you don't have a very good exit option. For those who did want to leave, the frontier was a much better choice. Average incomes there were lower than in the richest parts of China, but sweat equity would often get you cultivation rights to reclaimed land, as we've discussed. And with cities barely growing, most industry developed as rural industry, with the producers embedded in households that also farmed. The system remained relatively stable so long as these villages had external markets for the output of rural industry and paid taxes, which the state used to help underwrite economic, social, and ecological stability elsewhere. And here I think is something where I differ a little bit from what Avner said. It's true that the state is not providing very many of the public goods in rich areas. But the state is providing a fair percentage of the rather low quantity of public goods in poorer areas. And that's absolutely critical to stabilizing the system overall, because it is, of course, in the poorer areas where if public goods aren't provided, things are most likely to fall apart with important implications for stability. In short, lots of factors combined to make many of the features of closed corporate communities consistent with private property and land, free migration, and highly competitive markets, things that we don't usually think go with closed corporate communities. Given the time, I will not talk about 20th century stuff. Maybe we'll get to that in questions, but probably better to stop here.
What control did the bottom soil owners have? And do you have any sense of how the sort of effectively partial property rights that these two different agents had how that impacted bargaining between them over decisions relevant both to land improvement and possible transfer of land rights completely either to the bottom soil owner or to the now wealthier usufruct owner.
Okay, to start with the second question, the use rights and subsoil rights become separately alienable by the 18th century. The Chinese anthropologist Fei Xiaotong speaks of subsoil rights being sold like stocks and bonds, right? So, and part of the result of that is tenants sometimes don't even know who their landlord is. The subsoil owner retains the right to, well, A, to collect a certain rent, B, to repossess the land under certain fairly restricted circumstances. And obviously, if he gets to repossess the land, then he can hike the rent up for the next guy to whatever the market will bear now. And there is clearly bargaining around the edges that takes place, so that going to the way the system appears to work is if you go to the formal court system and get them to enforce the letter of the property law, chances are the landlord wins. But that's very expensive and difficult. So it provides some check on the most extreme form of tenant stubbornness. But it's a check that only kicks in, when things have already gone pretty far. One thing I should say about this that makes all of this really troubling is we have today there's a subgroup of landlord-tenant dispute cases that have survived in the archives. And people have done very interesting work on them. Then new evidence came to light that suggested that the cases that survived may be highly atypical, and that in particular the cases that survived may have been of a type in which the magistrate was less likely to defer to custom. But that's... So there's the other thing that's going on is I mentioned that in many cases, the way you first got into this plot was by putting down a pretty substantial rent deposit. This is in a rural society with high interest rates. That rent deposit is quite valuable. And so landlords are often getting and holding on to a chunk of capital, right, that they're using for other things. There too, because if you did dispossess the tenant, unless he owed you an amount of rent that had exceeded the deposit, you would then have to return the deposit. That becomes a disincentive for a landlord who's not particularly liquid.
Just in relation to Avner's talk, is the non-kin-based corporate village functionally a clan or functionally a corporation in his model, or something else entirely? And just to be more specific, does the customary adjudication, the customary procedures for management and dispute resolution within the non-kin-based corporate village lead to equally low costs of the kind that Avner would argue is an adaptive advantage of the clan in terms of, perpetuating it? So could you comment on that?
Right. I mean, I was trying to think through that as Avner was talking. And I think the answer is that it's something of a hybrid, right? That what you get is the village doesn't do all the things that a well-organized lineage does. It does not, for instance, provide security in the afterlife, which is a big deal. It does not, generally speaking, provide an heir for you if you are otherwise childless. Right? So there are some big things that the village doesn't do that a strong clan does. But it does do a fair amount. And my guess would be, and it really unfortunately is guesswork at this point, is that what you're going to find is that transaction costs are higher than in a true single lineage village of the kind you get in the Pearl River Delta. But they're low enough to get an awful lot of stuff done. One really interesting piece of work, though it's not the Yangzi Delta, but there are a couple of counties in Taiwan for which we have really, really good records, both of landholding and of adjudication of land disputes. And there's a Taiwanese scholar named Lin Wen Kai who's done some really interesting work. And what he finds, and it makes a lot of sense, is that up until the late 19th century, the system works really well. That you can cooperate for all sorts of purposes. Where it starts to fail, or I shouldn't even say fail, but where it encounters things that it cannot do, is after the Japanese occupation of Taiwan in 1895, when people get interested in introducing new kinds of technology and creating really large capital-intensive kinds of production. So people try to create sugar plantations, for instance. They can't work out the kinds of scales of pooling of land, borrowing for pretty expensive capital equipment, et cetera. That turns out to need cooperation that goes well beyond the village. And these institutions can't do that. But they can do most other things. And part of what I would want to argue, to go to the sort of very macro level, is that until you have technologies that require patient capital on a fairly large scale, the things that these kinds of villages can't do are not things that anybody wants to do anyway. But you're not going to build a railroad this way.
Back in the Qing, did these villages pay taxes to the county as a unit or through some sort of village rep?
In theory, tax is assessed on the individual plot of land.
Right.
In practice, the payments are often forwarded as a group. What makes it more complicated is sometimes the groups through which this forwarding occurs are coterminous with the groups that manage things like irrigation, but sometimes they aren't. And so in many cases you get these kind of cross-cutting, lots and lots of overlays of different institutions to carry on different tasks, which would have a high degree of overlap, but not perfect overlap.
Yeah, I'm looking for de facto legal recognition. That is, the county de facto recognizes the village or some equivalent as a corporate unit.
Before the 20th century, it's hard to find that. The one thing where you would find it, at least in a lot of places, is negotiation over the provision of corvée labor. So there's often an understanding, though again not written in law, that Village X provides 12 people for 3 days each, and that somebody who represents the village will actually go and sort of say, gee, that's a lot. How's about 10 people, right? So there is there's a kind of informal brokerage that goes on in which these communities are often the units. Again, I should say I used village as a shorthand. They're not always villages in the sense of a bunch of households lumped closely together. Sometimes, and this has a lot to do with simply the layout of the water, sometimes these things are spread out differently.
I have a question about the role of informal violence. I have a vague memory, and I'm not quite sure when and where that was. It might have been only in the 1930s, of dunning bureaus that sent people into the villages to collect outstanding rents. Is that a crisis phenomenon, or is that
you
something
get a
one
lot
finds
more of that. You get occasional instances of that even in the 18th century, but you get a lot more of it post-Taiping, so post-1865. One of the things that I sort of telescoped for reasons of time is that the Taiping Rebellion devastates this region, enormous death rates. And so one of the questions then becomes, when Reconstruction comes along, on what basis are these communities going to be reconstructed or not? In a number of cases, urban landlords who own the land try to reclaim it, take advantage of the fact that many of the tenants are dead, and bring in new tenants, usually from a poorer area to the north called Subei, as sort of tenants at will. For the most part, that fails, and it matters a lot why you think it fails. One argument is that it's a skill question, that these people who come in from Subei do not know how to operate the very complex irrigation systems. They're fine for the first 2 years or so when the irrigation systems aren't functioning yet again. But once they're rebuilt, you want people who actually know how to work them. And if that's your story, then a lot of the extra income that Yangzi Delta tenants earn by paying lower rents is actually a return to skill, right? It's not a rent in the economist sense of it. The other argument, though, is that it is, in fact, the community bands together to shove these people out by doing things like rebuilding the irrigation works but denying them access to the water. What eventually develops by the sort of 1870s, I would argue, is that landlords are able to renegotiate around the edges of this permanent tenancy system, so they get a slightly better deal for themselves. But the attempt to fundamentally uproot it and go to simple tenancy at will, that fails. And that's where these dunning bureaus come in. In some cases, what also happens is, because it's the landlords, in many cases, who are actually paying the land tax, right? Tax goes with ownership, not with cultivation rights. The state wants to make sure that they're collecting enough rent so that the taxes get paid. And in the late 19th and early 20th century, as tax rates go up, and that becomes an increasingly dicey proposition, the state becomes increasingly willing to actually let landlords borrow the coercive force of the county government to make sure that rents get collected, because that's what gets taxes collected. But that's a 20th century phenomenon for the most part.
Maybe Avner would like to intervene in this debate.
Well, I'm definitely aware of local variations. Maybe local variations definitely existed, and you pointed out the distinction between them. I like your suggestion that this is intermediary body in between. I think it's It might be interesting to know the distribution of last names in these villages and the number of ancestry halls and other indications that will reveal to us what is the relationship in terms of the kinship base. But that's exactly what the research project is about, right? I don't know if there's more or less ancestry halls. It would be nice if we had this data.
There are lots and lots of them, and they're mostly, I think, though, I don't have firm data, the market towns rather than the villages.
Yeah, that's might be. The question is how many tablets there are and what are the names.
Yeah.
And that's an important question.
Right.
We wanted to see.
Yeah.
And let me mention also that in the north, I don't want to take from your time, I mentioned in the north there is a lot of kinship-like organizations which are based on temples rather than on kinship per se. They are like you comment about the frontiers, about the state does more in terms of areas that are poorer. It's definitely also the case of the frontiers themselves, which is military government rather than, so it's, again, it's a different way. So I think the picture is rich and it's nice to get the richness and so on and so forth. So really, I like it. It was very fun.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.